staff to undertake a comprehensive review of Ottawa's taxi and limousine regulations, including potential regulations to recognize the emergence of new hailing technologies and transportation 4B service models, in recognition of the need to address the pressures being created by the non-traditional service models. I want to start by thanking all those individuals in bringing us to this point today, especially the 6,000 plus participants who submitted their comments and feedback during the consultation phase that will have helped to shape the future of the vehicle for hire industry in the City of Ottawa. Today, the City is answering the public's demand for change. You will see that the recommendations being proposed by staff look to open up our vehicle for hire industry to legally allow private transportation companies such as Uber to operate in the City of Ottawa. Let me just say that it has been a monumental challenge modernizing the taxi and limousine industries and folding in emergency vehicle for hire business models such as private transportation companies. I can assure you that a great deal of thoughtful consideration has gone into the recommendations. As the regulator, we established 3 core guiding principles: public safety, consumer protection, and the public policy goal of accessibility. Let's be clear, the public has overwhelmingly indicated that they want greater choice in their transportation options. They also want greater protections to meet public demand for vehicle for hire options cannot and should not be done without also considering what changes are necessary to ensure the ongoing viability of the current taxi and limousine industries and allowing these businesses the flexibility to innovate and compete in order to improve consumer protection, public safety, and accessibility. In the report, staff have incorporated common measures across the vehicle for hire classes with specific measures that recognize the different consumer expectations and requirements for each. Ultimately, the City, as the regulator, has taken the advice of the Competition Bureau and our consultant, KPMG. This advice has been supported again today with the release of the Mars Solution Labs report in Toronto. Here's what they had to say. It should be stated that regulation is not failing here, nor is government for that matter. Regulation is always a reflection of what is happening in society. It constantly has to catch up with a world that is always changing, and there is nothing wrong with that. The challenge is to design effective regulation that protects the public interest, does not stifle innovation, and reduces administrative burden, while also adapting to the changed environment to the best of its ability. In moving toward a more modern, innovative, and competitive market environment, the City no longer believes that the same level of regulation that existed in the past will be necessary in the future. Assuming City Council agrees with the staff recommendations to license new hailing technology, staff are also recommending taking the handcuffs off the taxi industry, trusting that greater competition will ultimately lead to improved customer service and satisfaction. What you will hear in this briefing is a myriad of ways that staff are recommending reducing or eliminating the regulatory requirements on the taxi industry while still maintaining our 3 core principles: public safety, consumer protection, and accessibility. To the extent possible, we have leveled the playing field, all the while recognizing that new hailing technologies, taxis, and limousines are all different. While we view traditional taxi service in Ottawa as an important part of the public transportation network, we have come to recognize that other app-based transportation services are largely private arrangements between 2 parties. While we are proposing to set minimum standards on private transportation companies to ensure public safety and consumer protection, we also want the public to appreciate that this service comes with a buyer beware warning. Disputes about fares or customer satisfaction, for example, will be resolved between the parties without the city's involvement. On the other hand, taxis will continue to be viewed as part of the public transportation network, will offer a greater level of consumer protection and regulatory requirements that address public safety measures, among other things. Both private transportation companies and taxis would still be subject to review by the city's License and Property Standards Committee if an issue related to the licensing of the business is brought forward. The public will have a clear choice. Continue to use taxis where street hails, cab stands, cash transactions, cameras in vehicles, roof signs, and vehicle identification will combine to ensure consumer convenience and protection, or arrange a private ride through an app where a basic level of consumer protection will be in place. Before I turn the presentation over to Mr. DeMonte, I just want to reiterate that preparation of this report has been comprehensive and all-encompassing. The staff have taken this work very seriously, understanding that any change comes with concern for those working in the industry. The committee will hear the public and stakeholder reaction on April 7th, and if need be, April 8th, and make any recommendations to council on April 13th. Having said that, I believe the recommendations are solid, well considered, and ultimately in the best interest of our residents for the 21st century. Now I'll turn the floor over to Mr. DeMonte.
Chair Deans, councillors, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My task this afternoon over the next half hour or so is to walk you through both the process of council's direction to staff, the work that was done by our consultant, staff review, and then ultimately the recommendations that we're proposing for council to consider with regards to this file. Last spring, council directed staff to undertake a comprehensive review of Ottawa's taxi and limousine regulations. We were directed to do this review understanding the city's responsibility as a regulator, and the guiding principles that we were tasked with were assure public safety, consumer protection, and one of council's public policy goals, accessibility. And that is how the work has gone through, and we've proceeded throughout this body of work. This comprehensive review and consultation was undertaken, has been far-reaching and thorough to achieve council's direction. Consultation with cities of Toronto, Calgary, and Edmonton, as well as the public transportation network stakeholders such as Paratranspo and the future light rail operations were part of this comprehensive review process, understanding that transportation cannot be looked at as a silo, but must be looked broadly. Benchmarking with other major Canadian cities were also provided. Council approved this work as part of its city's strategic plan, and as such, funds were set aside and the procurement process undertaken, and KPMG was the consultant retained to provide a body of the work. KPMG partnered with other organizations who had expertise in different areas to assist them as they led this process. The Moment Center, Para Associates, and Core Strategies Incorporated developed the body of work that followed and then informed our staff recommendations today. The review had three distinct phases: a research component, a consultation, and then finally analysis and reporting. Six discussion papers were released to the public during this process. The first were case studies examining other jurisdictions across North America, which included multiple cities, including New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. Review the current regulatory regime with regards to what we currently have as legislative authority under law, the bylaws that currently exist, and then finally, a third research paper on emerging issues and the impacts that are being seen both locally and globally. A fourth paper on accessibility, one of Council's prime policy objectives, and we looked at and discussed with Paratranspo. We understood what was going on with their accessibility cabs. As well, Taxi Economics, as another paper that was produced, looking at old and new and understanding the dynamics that take place in the environment of the taxi industry with regards to economics. And finally, the customer experience was researched and observed. Extensive consultations through various channels, which included workshops, webinars, social media, and online, with over 6,000 submissions, as Chair Dean mentioned, via our taxi hotline and email were received and reviewed and formed part of the body of this work. All of the work led to the development of a policy options paper, which identified 3 key strategic areas to help modernize and streamline vehicle for hire regulations that KPMG then used to solicit feedback. KPMG's final report was provided to the city at the end of 2015, as had been dictated, and is included as part of our staff report. It also became part of the foundational work for our staff analysis. Of the 70 KPMG recommendations put forward, only 3 were not adopted by city staff. Overall, staff recommendations for Council's consideration led to 3 broad-based reforms to support the public and private transportation networks. The first, establish a new licensing category for transportation network companies, which we have chosen to refer as private transportation companies, recognizing the private nature of these service providers in contrast to the taxi industry's role as part of our public transportation network. The second was to deregulate and modernize the taxi and limousine regulations. And finally, this would help enhance competition and foster innovation. In the core assumptions, there are various vehicle for hire categories to be regulated. One is new, as I've just mentioned, and the others are currently regulated, but will require reform to deregulate and to diminish some of the regulatory environment that they currently operate in. While similar in nature, in terms of services provided, they each have very different service delivery models. Let me go through some of those in detail. So private transportation company clients enjoy the convenience of an app, knowing both the price of the trip and the wait time in advance, the ability to see the driver and vehicle ratings, and the absence of a cash transaction. Taxi users value the safety and security of the ride, the ability to use cash, the confidence of having a professional driver who knows the best route, the ability to street hail and use taxi stands, and the protection from surge pricing, as well as the benefit of a formal complaint process, as Chair Deans indicated, that the city is directly involved in. Finally, limousine users have the ability to receive a tailored, specialized experience from a professional driver, pre-book rides with the price negotiated and understood in advance. As we go through, what quickly became clear is we wanted to establish some common features. There are common elements in all of these categories. Every category will be required to have a police records check for service with a vulnerable sector and a statement of driving record for their drivers as part of our recommendations. Given the more transient nature of the private transportation companies and limousine drivers, staff are proposing that the police record checks in those cases, the requirement be completed on an annual basis. For taxi drivers, they must have one done every 3 years and a waiver provided annually when they renew their taxi driver's license. Another common element being proposed is the age limit for vehicle for hires of all models of 10 years, with a requirement for a MTO safety standard certificate and a twice a year for vehicles over 5 years, and that would be standardized across all categories. The city will continue to inspect the taxis to ensure the cameras or meters are functioning properly, very specific to that industry. And it will be the responsibility of the PTCs and limousine companies to ensure that the age limit and inspection requirements are met, and the city will continue to have the authority to spot audit and inspections on both the PTC vehicles and limousines to ensure that is being done. Staff, on the advice of the City of Ottawa's insurance broker, is recommending that the minimum $5 million liability insurance be required across all categories of coverage of vehicles for hire to ensure adequate coverage. Again, a standardization across all categories. I've just provided you with an overview of the regulatory elements common to the 3 vehicle categories. Now I'd like to address each category that have unique requirements. So let's first start with the PTC requirements. Staff is recommending that private transportation companies be regulated to put in place measures that ensure public safety and consumer protection. Again, the lens is our role as a city, as a regulator. This approach will provide greater customer choice, but it is important to understand that in our view, this is a buyer beware model, and customers understand that they're entering into an agreement for a specific level of service through a private transaction. Private transportation companies are similar to taxi brokers in that they connect passengers as well. Therefore, licensing fees for private transportation companies will be the same as taxi broker fees, based on fleet size. However, in the case of private transportation companies, an additional 10.5 cents per ride is proposed to offset the enforcement costs and any non-compliance that may occur. As well, as you can see on the slide, and I'll talk about it later, certain areas for PTCs will not be allowed. They can only pre-arrange through an app. Accessibility, one of Council's top policy priorities, and one that we are actually very happy over the last little while. Ottawa enjoys the highest accessible taxi fleet in the country, with over 16%. So it's certainly something that staff took into consideration and want to ensure we continue providing that level of service. Accessibility is a guiding principle for this review to ensure that the city continues to provide accessible community with the appropriate transportation options. In the absence of having the authority currently, staff is proposing that a voluntary per-trip surcharge be levied to private transportation companies while the city petitions the province for enabling legislation to ensure that we can impose that. For the taxi industry, proposed reduction in taxi regulations. Again, referring to this segment, subject to the regulatory approval of the proposed private transportation company of unnecessary regulations and the reduction of fees for the taxi industry to more accurately reflect the cost of enforcement as a result of a new partner entering this field. With the introduction of app-based transportation services in 2014, the cost of enforcement of this illegal activity was borne by the taxi industry. This will be more appropriately shift the burden to enforcement costs from the taxi industry to the private transportation companies, as I've mentioned, that are now benefit from being permitted to operate in Ottawa. Staff is therefore proposing to allow variable pricing through prearranged fares, provided the customer books through an app, even in the taxi industry. However, subject to a maximum prescribed fare approved in the bylaw to ensure consumer protection in this area. It is proposed to eliminate most taxi cab vehicle standards as well. As previously stated, this establishes similar standards for all vehicle for hire that being introduced to allow competition with the intent to drive consumer choice based on the quality of product. Ergo, the vehicles as they deem necessary to driver education in a time where drivers require knowledge. However, it is proposed to continue and retain the accessibility training program. In 2007, Council, at the request of the taxi industry as well, agreed to apply an additional processing fee